In 2020, Times Network had launched India Revival Mission to find out ways to reboot, reload and relaunch the Indian economy. The idea was to find innovative solutions to help India deal with the impact of coronavirus pandemic, to help it emerge stronger. And as part of this mission, Times Network along with Institute for Competitiveness developed India Revival Mission White Paper. And today we are here to discuss the highlights. We have with us former RBI Governor, Mr. D. Subbarao. Sir, thank you very much for joining us here on this special broadcast, special edition of India Revival Mission. Now, as part of the white paper and the findings, of this entire program that we had over the last 1 year, the indication is that the green shoots are emerging, but still challenging times lie ahead for the economy. How do you see, sir, India's revival mission?
Well, it's somewhat heartening that the recovery has come sooner than we expected, and the downturn has also been less deep than we feared. Just imagine last year around this time, indeed as recently as even 6 months ago, we were worried that the contraction of the economy might be 10% or even 15%. Now we're told that the economy is going to contract by 8% this year. That is bad, but relative to 15%, it is still comforting. Next year, we understand that there's going to be a rebound. Estimates of output expansion next year growth are from about 11% of the RBI and the government to 13.5 to 14% of some of the investment banks and analysts. But here's the important thing. Even if there's going to be a V-shaped rebound next year, we must understand that at the end of FY22, at the end of next year, we're going to be worse off relative to the pre-pandemic growth path. Look at our growth profile over the last 5 years. 4 years ago, we were growing at 8%. 3 years ago at 7%. 2 years ago at 6%. Last year at 4%. This year contracting by 8%. Next year 13% or 14%. So even if we have that V-shaped rebound, at the end of FY22, the output is going to be lower than what it would have been without the pandemic. So we've got to be aware of that.
So do you think probably some, drastic steps are needed to help bring the economy back to that pre-COVID level?
I'm not sure I would say drastic steps. Certainly steps are required to bring the economy to the pre-COVID level. So there certainly would be a permanent loss of output compared to the pre-COVID growth trajectory. But our endeavor should be to catch up with the trend line as soon as possible, put the economy on a high growth trajectory. Certainly a lot of things need to be done. I would not call them drastic, but those are things that are already known. Some of them are indeed mentioned in the Times Network's very laudable white paper that you referred to. I think the government needs to implement all of them very systematically, effectively and energetically, and they're already doing some of that.
Okay. Now, let's also discuss the highlights specifically. There are at least 4 recommendations that have been mentioned in this white paper that we are discussing. One of them is empowering low-skilled manufacturing. Do you think, sir, India is doing enough to seize the opportunity in manufacturing that is available? Are the steps being taken in the right direction?
Well, first let's talk about, you spoke about manufacturing and then low-skilled manufacturing. So first let's focus on manufacturing. I think manufacturing is key to India's economic growth and India's economic prospects. Why is that? If you look at development history, as countries progress, they start off with a high share of agriculture in GDP, but as they move up the ladder, the share of agriculture goes down, share of industry and manufacturing goes up, and then after some time, share of manufacturing goes down and share of services goes up. So development history tells us that the progression is from agriculture to manufacturing to services. India defied that paradigm. Yes, our share of agriculture in GDP had come down, but it's not manufacturing that went up, it's services that went up.
Yes.
Now we realize that we need to focus on manufacturing. If you got to get onto a high growth trajectory, if you want to generate jobs, we need to focus on manufacturing. Agriculture is not going to create jobs. In fact, agriculture is going to throw out tens of millions of people if indeed productivity goes up. We can't have job growth in services. Services sector cannot create productive, high-value jobs. So we need to focus on the manufacturing sector. You know, if you compare with a country like Vietnam, for example, between 2000 and 2020, the share of manufacturing in GDP had doubled. For India, it went up barely from up 2 percentage points, from about 15% to 17%. And the share of manufacturing in jobs had remained fairly stagnant.
Yes.
So for jobs, for economic growth, we need to focus on manufacturing. Now, on the second part of your question, Hina, about low-skill manufacturers, yes, we need to focus on that because, as I said earlier, if agriculture productivity goes up, it's going to throw maybe 100 million people. Now, we've got to get jobs for those people, and those people are unskilled. So it's very important that we focus on unskilled manufacturing, at least for the next 10 years, and there's enormous potential, both in the domestic market as well as the export market for unskilled manufacturers. In fact, I heard a lecture by Paul Krugman at Ashoka University a couple of weeks ago, and this is indeed what he was saying, that there is still scope for low-skill manufacturing. But the important thing is that even as we focus on low-skill manufacturing for the next decade, we need to simultaneously focus on improving the skill endowment.
Okay.
Ensure that we do not get locked into a low-skill profile, you know. So for the next 10 years, focus on low-skill manufacture, but at the same time, focus on improving the skill endowment so that we can move up the value chain.
Those are very interesting, in fact, insight that you have shared with us. Now, the second recommendation, Mr. Subbarao, is that we need to boost the domestic consumption of durables. A lot of steps were taken by the government during the last 6 months when the unlocking phase started. Do you think they have given us the desired results? And what is your opinion on the issue of consumption of durables? Where do you think it is currently?
Well, there are two parts to that question. On the first part, the government's fiscal stimulus over the last 1 year since the pandemic broke out in India, the government did make some transfer payments, expanded the Manrega to provide livelihood support. But that was more in the nature of providing support for consumption of non-durables, not so much durables. In fact, millions of people had seen their incomes go down, their savings go down, their purchasing power go down. So the effort and endeavor of the government was to make sure that they have enough to live by and that their livelihoods are protected. That was more for the consumption of non-durables, durables. Now, encouraging consumption of non-durables is more a medium-term effort, I would imagine. And it's very important as we come out of the pandemic, as we want to put the economy in a high growth trajectory. Our economic prospects depend on producing non-durables and ensuring that incomes of low-income people go up so that they consume the non-durables. So two things are important. We must encourage production of non-durables so that production goes up, investment thereby adds to growth and jobs are generated. That incomes go up, especially of the low-income people whose marginal propensity to consume is high, so that they use the money, they use the higher incomes to consume durables. So it's a good proposition. It's something to work on both from the production and consumption side.
Okay. And in the white paper, Mr. Subbarao, there's also a mention specifically of Taiwan and how it dealt with the impact of 2008 economic recession. Of course, India at that time did not have this kind of an impact, but this pandemic, gave us a technical recession. We seem to be slowly coming out of it, but of course, challenges are continuing. Do you think that kind of a voucher system can work in a country like India, what Taiwan used?
See, I'm not very familiar with the Taiwan voucher system. But if what Taiwan did was actually to give vouchers to people which were specifically tailored for the production, for the consumption of durables, perhaps yes. But instead of government deciding for people what they should buy, I think it should give them the freedom and flexibility to decide what they want to consume. Obviously, the first thing people want is livelihood. So they want to consume food and clothing and shelter. They want to spend on that. And as their incomes go up, as they generate and store some savings, they want to buy more durable goods. And I'm not sure if in a large economy like this, given our poverty levels, our income levels, our voucher system is either necessary or sufficient. I would think that giving people the higher incomes, more secure jobs, making them feel more secure about their future, is itself sufficient for them to shift from buying non-durables to durables. So they will certainly do that.
And before I move on, since we are discussing the voucher issue, the centre had, come out with this LTC voucher scheme. So do you think that was a bad idea because you were forcing people to buy a certain kind of products?
Well, the LTC voucher was a different proposition altogether. You must look at that in the context of the time. India was in the lockdown, complete lockdown. Travel was not allowed. Travel was not possible. On the other hand, government employees had the benefit of LTC. Government wanted to stimulate the economy, stimulate consumption. Therefore, converting the LTC benefit into vouchers was a very innovative scheme, I thought, at that time. But you cannot extrapolate what was good during the time of lockdown for a very limited section of stakeholders, which is government employees, to the large economy during a time of, when there is no lockdown and there is no restriction on mobility. I am not sure a voucher system is the most optimal thing to do.
Several times you've talked about the issue of, interest rates as well. Can I just ask you one more question before I talk about the last suggestion that has been given in this white paper?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
What do you think about the current rate cycle that we are seeing? Where do you see them heading from here on? For the depositors as well who want to earn more money, it's a very, very difficult time. Government is trying hard to ensure that banks, lend more. So many schemes are there. I mean, where do you see this rate cycle really heading from here on? And any thoughts on inflation targeting mechanism?
Yeah, first, to give some background to your question, this is a dilemma that the Reserve Bank always confronts, even in benign times, that you want to give low interest rates for borrowers in order to encourage investment. On the other hand, you want to give high interest rates to savers to encourage savings. So where do you manage this trade-off tension between the requirements of investors and the demands of the savers? That's a dilemma for all central banks. It's a dilemma for the Reserve Bank of India. Now, coming to the context of the economic crisis triggered by the pandemic, the Reserve Bank has resorted to extraordinary easing to inspire confidence in the economy, to stimulate the economy as they cut interest rates very low. infused an enormous amount of liquidity and came out with some innovative schemes like targeted LTROs, etc. The endeavor, the motivation for that was to stimulate credit. That's really not happened because of the risk aversion in the economy for all the problems that we are familiar with. Banks are not yet willing to lend, they're risk averse. Corporates are not willing to borrow because they too are risk averse. So going forward, the Reserve Bank will certainly have to raise interest rates in order to manage inflation, but they will have to do it non-disruptively so that it does not disrupt the recovery. That's going to be a challenge for the Reserve Bank, and they've done very well so far, and I'm sure that they're going to navigate the way forward very intelligently as they have done all this while.
And on inflation?
On the inflation targeting question, yes. Okay, on inflation. Again, the Reserve Bank has been trying to manage this tension between supporting growth and maintaining, combating inflation. Over the last 6 months, we saw growth has recovered, but it's still very low. The economy is still in contraction. On the other hand, paradoxically, inflation had gone above the Reserve Bank's tolerance band, above 6%. So that was a very difficult challenge for the Reserve Bank. In the event, they decided to look through the inflation because they saw this transient phenomenon and decided to maintain an easy monetary policy stance in order to support recovery, which I believe was appropriate. But inflation pressures are still strong. Core inflation momentum is still high. So sooner rather than later, the Reserve Bank will have to get down to this task of managing inflation. For that, they'll have to start withdrawing liquidity and raising interest rates over a period of time in a very calibrated and non-disruptive manner. And it's very important to prepare the market for it so that there are no hiccups on the way forward. That's one of the lessons we learned from the global financial crisis, not just the Reserve Bank of India, all the central banks around the world.
I think that's a very, very interesting and important suggestion that you have given for the Reserve Bank of India. And sir, the last suggestion that is mentioned in the white paper is about strengthening public investment, special focus on the healthcare sector. Your thoughts?
Well, strengthening public investment and focusing on health and education is like motherhood and apple pie. You have to do it, okay? It's the recipe for growth, increasing investment so that our potential growth rate goes up, and increasing the production base and improving the productivity of that production base. So we need public investment by way of infrastructure to crowd in private investment and to expand the production base. We need investment in education and health to improve the productivity of that investment. So the recipe for growth is to expand the production base and improve productivity. Spending more is important. Spending on infrastructure, spending on health and education is important. And we read in all the reports that India's spending on health and education as a proportion of GDP is low compared not just to rich countries, but even compared to other emerging economies. That's very important. But what is not recognized, what's not often said is this, and I want to say this.
Yes, sir.
I was finance secretary at the state level, I was finance secretary at Government of India level. What is important is not only do you spend more, but ensure that the productivity of that spending is high. Take Sri Lanka, for example. They spend less than us as a proportion of GDP on education and health. But their education and health outcomes are better than ours.
Yes.
So I say, yes, certainly increase spending, that's important, but focus equally importantly, indeed more importantly, on improving the productivity of that investment in education and health.
Productivity of investment is extremely critical. Thank you very much, Mr. Subbarao, for speaking with us here on Times Network and giving us such important, and innovative solutions that our policymakers can clearly implement to deal with the crisis that we are all into. Of course, green shoots have started emerging, but simultaneously, the way COVID numbers are rising, these kind of suggestions are really going to be very, very crucial for the government and the RBI. Thank you, Mr. Subbarao, for speaking with us.